Hi everyone, this is just a short video on social work ethics and ethical practice with organizations. So just as always, a quick reminder of where we are. We're looking now at ethics sort of in the context of specific populations and specific organizational contexts. So we've looked at ethics with people who have survived trauma, vulnerable populations, and this week we're talking about organizations. The Let me sort of contextualize sort of where we are at this, near end point of the semester. Um, what we're doing is really talking through some of the ethical issues that are relevant in a certain context and with certain populations. Um, the reality is that the context and the populations with whom social workers work are very broad and incredibly diverse, and frankly, we're covering what, four or five of them here in class. There are probably dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens that all have sort of unique ethical standards, and it would frankly be impossible um, to cover all of those sort of relevant ethical issues in all of those unique contexts and with all of those unique populations. And then when you start considering, um, sort of all of the specifics and the details and the possible combinations and permutations of populations and contexts, you just complicate the ethical landscape, exponentially. Um, so really, this point of or what this part of the course is about is sort of modeling how you would think through some of the ethical issues in a given context. And my recommendation is that you think about the unique ethical issues in the first few weeks of a new job or a new internship or field placement, much the same way we're doing with this class. It's really just an act of spending a few minutes with the code of ethics and thinking, well, this particular standard might be relevant here because, or this particular standard wouldn't be relevant, or this particular standard might only be relevant if X, Y, and Z happen. So that's sort of the big context of where we are at this point. So let's talk about social work and organizations. So almost all social work care happens under the context of the auspices of an organization. Most of us, especially out of graduate school, find work in an organization. There's a lot of reasons for that. We'll talk about them here on the next slide. But keep in mind that organizations could be public, they could be private, they could be religiously affiliated, or secular, sort of independent. It could be profit for profit or non for profit. That might be part of a network of agencies or a standalone. They could be majority or minority social work. Interestingly, when social workers are not the sort of majority employee, that's called a host setting. So, for example, social workers who work in a hospital are a host setting. So the primary sort of profession that staffs a hospital would be, a physician or a nurse or something like that. Social workers are a small minority of those employees, so that's considered a host setting. A school would be the same thing. The majority of employees at a school are teachers, and some social workers who are employed at schools are a very, very small minority of those employees, so that would also be considered a host setting. But what is it that organizations do for us? They're very useful, and they frankly facilitate the delivery of social work services. They provide office space and phones and computers and internet and office supplies, like pens and pencils and folders and space to store folders and client records and things like that. And that's pretty mundane. But if you were interested in starting an organization or even a private practice, these are things that you have to think about. Where are you going to do that? How are you going to sort of administer all of that stuff as well? But organizations are also licensed or authorized to provide care. So in New York State, they might be They might be licensed by OMH, I mean, obviously depending on the kind of work they do, or JACO or something like that. There's lots of other licensing or authorizing organizations. But organizations also invest in their employees in the form of professional development and supervision. And then the last thing that organizations have is clout or reputation. Clients know about them. Uh, um, Communities know about them. Insurance companies and other referral providers sort of know about them. So social work has a long history of providing services in the context of organizations. Like I said, they facilitate an awful lot of our work. And frankly, the point of this slide is to say that organizations sort of take care of a number of the administrative and supervisory related things, which lets social workers focus on delivering services as opposed to worrying about, paying the electric bill or paying the rent or something like that. Moving on here, though, the other thing to keep in mind is that organizations have policy and procedure manuals. They might not be called that, but they're something akin to that, that oftentimes are consistent with ethical practice, or at the very least provide more information for those ethical reasoning processes that we have to engage in. Nevertheless, there's a lot of ethical issues that are sort of incumbent when we work with organizations. So we have ethical obligations towards colleagues, so people who are on the same level of us, supervisees, so people who are lower than us, people who would report to us, students, people who are there to learn from us. And then we also have obligations towards what are known as client organizations and employing organizations. Now, most of us, when we think about organizations, probably think about employing organizations. So for example, I teach this class for Keuka College. So Keuka is an employing organization for me. Catholic Charities is a big human service provider in the region. They would, if I worked for them, they would be an employing organization. But a client organization actually happens when the organization is actually someone that is contracted with us in sort of a consultation kind of consultative kind of relationship. So sometimes social workers in later stages of their careers are contracted to provide supervision to employees, and in that case, the person providing supervision would have as her or his client that organization and the people to whom she or he was providing supervision. And so it's important to think that to acknowledge that organizations themselves can also be sort of our clients, and that happens when we get into consultancy kinds of work and consultancy kinds of roles. So believe it or not, the Code of Ethics has a pretty rich sort of discussion about ethical behavior towards organizations. So standards 2.01 to 2.10 discuss things like respect and confidentiality, collaboration, conflict, sexual boundaries between clients, our obligation towards helping a client through an impairment, defending colleagues when they're charged with unethical conduct, so on and so forth. So these would all be examples of sort of our ethical obligations to our peers or to our colleagues. But we also have ethical guidelines and standards when it comes to supervisees, and they have to do with things like competence, boundaries and dual relationships, competence, I listed that twice, education, training, and evaluation. I think the reason I listed competence twice is because I wanted to make sure I talked about it. So competence, when it comes to working with a supervisee or working with a student, means that you're really providing training, mentoring, supervision, so on and so forth, and things that one is qualified to provide training, mentorship, supervision, things like that. So, but we also, in this last bullet point here, have obligations to agencies. So we have a commitment to our employers. We have a commitment to maintain records and to see billing through. We have a commitment to confidentiality and whistleblowing. What is meant by commitment to employers? What that means is that when we're working on behalf of an organization, we're genuinely working on that organization's behalf. So let me give you an example of that. So let me finish that sentence and then I'll give you an example. So when we're working on the organization's behalf, we're genuinely working on the organization's behalf and not on someone else's behalf. So let me give you an example of that real quick. It's pretty common for social workers to have a private practice in addition to being part of an agency and also providing clinical services. And because we have a commitment to employers, when we're working on behalf of an agency, we can't poach clients from the agency for our private practice. We have to quite literally get referrals for our private practice from a completely different source. Otherwise, we're in an ethical violation there. What is whistleblowing? Whistleblowing is really nothing more than the act of reporting unethical behavior, problematic behavior. And so, to whom does one report? Well, we would report to a supervisor or that person's supervisor, so on and so forth up the ladder. We might also report to the executive, the executive director, the CEO, the COO, that kind of thing, or even the board. We might also report to licensing bodies, so people who credential and authorize agencies to do the kind of work that they do. That licensing body is often a state or federal licensing body, and in really extreme circumstances, we might report to the media. Whistleblowers should be protected under federal law. It gets really muddy, and this is very far out of my area of expertise, but it gets muddy when one is reporting to certain bodies and when one is reporting about certain things. I think the most famous recent, although non-social work, example of a whistleblower would probably be someone like Edward Snowden. He obviously is still the U.S. government still wants to prosecute him, so it doesn't appear as though there's a whole lot of federal protection for him. Although, like I said, that's a non-social work example, and that's very far out of my my expertise. There are a few other organizational issues to consider here. Like I said, the general sort of consensus in the literature is that organizations typically do a good job at facilitating the delivery of social work services. Like I said, they have a long history in our profession as being, part of our profession and facilitating that work. So organizations provide supervision as part of employment, and supervision really is a good time to sort through ethical problems. You can use a supervisor as a consultant. They can mediate problems between employees or between different levels of the organizations. And really, supervisors and administrators should support and model ethical behavior, even if they're coming from a different discipline than a social worker is working in a host setting. Really, ethical behavior should be part of an organization's culture, and typically when an organization doesn't support sort of ethical behavior, there's other sort of big toxic issues going on as well that are sort of in addition to unethical problems. So things that might challenge ethical standards or ethical behavior at sort of an organizational level is an increasing focus on sort of financial stability and profitability. There's a well-known social work scholar named Mimi Abramovitz. I believe she works at Hunter, who talks about this idea of new public management, which is really the infiltration of the for-profit world into the non-profit world, and human service organizations, which were formerly nonprofit, are increasingly asked to demonstrate financial stability or financial sustainability and sometimes profitability. But these are things that might challenge ethical behavior or sustained ethical behavior. Another thing that might challenge ethical behavior is a focus on productivity standards, and that might be seeing X number of clients per day or X number of clients per week, or maintaining a certain billing threshold, that kind of thing. Focus on documentation and billing might also challenge ethical standards, as might clients who are especially difficult or really severely impaired, clients who take a lot of time and resources. There are times when organizations want to discharge those clients from their rosters in order to maintain a certain productivity threshold or a certain habilitation or rehabilitation threshold. And lastly, the last thing that might challenge ethical standards are sort of increasing competition between organizations for scarce resources. But there's a number of things that might support ethical behavior, and that's things like transparency, a healthy culture, a strong and ethical leadership, organizational commitment to learning and growth, certainly trauma-informed policies, or even if the trauma-informed idea is not written in policy, but there's at least an orientation towards trauma-informed work that supports ethical behavior. Good relationships between supervisees and colleagues and things like that support ethical behavior. And then lastly, decisions made by committee or by group or simply with lots of input from lots of different stakeholders. So these are things, this is a brainstorm on my part. These are things that I thought would support ethical behavior. If you have others, you're certainly welcome to share them with me. So I will end it there. Thanks for watching. As always, if you have questions, feel free to get in touch.